The morning of my 30th birthday began with sunlight spilling through the thin curtains of my apartment, turning the dust in the air into floating gold. I remember lying in bed for a few seconds longer than usual, staring at the ceiling and thinking that 30 felt heavier than I had expected. Not older exactly, just more permanent. Like a line had been drawn behind me, separating who I used to be from whoever I was supposed to become next. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. Messages from friends, coworkers, and extended family filled the screen with balloons and cake emojis. At the very top was a message from my mother. "Don't forget dinner tonight. Your father and I have a surprise." A second message followed a few seconds later. "Wear something nice." My parents had always loved milestones. Graduations, first job, promotions, everything became a family event, complete with decorations and carefully staged photos. It was one of the things I had always appreciated about them. Growing up, I used to tell people I had the kind of parents you only saw in movies: supportive, attentive, always present. Even now, at 30, my mother still called me every Sunday without fail, and my father still insisted on fixing things in my apartment, even when I could easily afford to hire someone. Still, there was something about the word surprise that made a small knot form in my stomach. I told myself it was just nerves about getting older. I spent the day at work pretending to focus on emails while secretly checking the time every few minutes. My coworkers had decorated my desk with a paper banner and a tiny cupcake with a single candle stuck into the frosting. They sang, I laughed, and for a moment everything felt perfectly normal. But in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about my parents' message and the odd urgency in my mother's voice when she had called the night before to confirm I would be there. No matter what. By the time evening came, I had changed outfits twice before settling on a navy blue dress that my mother had bought for me the previous year. It still had the tag tucked into the seam where she'd hidden it as a joke. I remember smiling when I noticed it, cutting it off, and thinking that she had always known my size perfectly. It was a small, comforting detail, proof of how well she knew me. Their house looked different the moment I pulled into the driveway. Every light was on, and through the front windows, I could see silhouettes moving back and forth. My parents' car was parked at an angle like they had rushed home. I sat in my car for a second longer than necessary, gripping the steering wheel, trying to shake the strange sense that I was arriving late to something important. When I opened the front door, a chorus of voices shouted, "Surprise!" The living room was packed with people, relatives I hadn't seen in years, my parents' old friends, even a few neighbors from when I was a child. Balloons were tied to the staircase railing, and a massive cake sat on the dining table, decorated with delicate pink icing roses and the number 30 in glittering gold. My mother rushed forward and wrapped her arms around me so tightly that I could barely breathe. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You look beautiful." My father stood just behind her, smiling in that quiet way of his. He squeezed my shoulder and nodded, as if words were unnecessary between us. For a moment, I felt overwhelmed by how loved I was. People kept hugging me, handing me small gift bags, telling me how grown up I looked, how proud my parents must be. But as the evening went on, I began to notice things that felt slightly off. My mother hovered near me constantly, refilling my glass before it was empty, guiding me from one conversation to another, like she was afraid I might drift away. My father kept checking his watch and glancing toward the front door. I caught them whispering to each other in the kitchen, their voices low and tense. When I walked in to grab another drink, they fell silent and smiled too quickly. "You okay?" I asked, half laughing. "You're acting like I'm getting married tonight instead of just getting older." My mother's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "We just wanted everything to be perfect for you," she said, smoothing an invisible wrinkle on the tablecloth. The cake was brought out around 9. Everyone gathered in the living room as my father dimmed the lights. The candles flickered, casting soft shadows across the walls. I closed my eyes to make a wish, something I hadn't done seriously since I was a child. For a second, I considered wishing for clarity about why the night felt so strange, but I settled for something simple and safe: happiness for all of us. As I blew out the candles, everyone cheered. My mother wiped at her eyes with a napkin, laughing as she did it. Cameras flashed. It was the kind of moment that should have felt like a memory in the making. One of those scenes you look back on years later with warmth. Instead, I felt a chill run down my spine. After the cake was cut and plates were passed around, the front doorbell rang. The sound was sharp and unexpected, cutting through the hum of conversation. My father stiffened beside me. My mother's hand froze halfway to her mouth. For a split second, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. "I'll get it," my father said quickly, setting his plate down. But he didn't move right away. He looked at my mother, and something passed silently between them. Something that made my chest tighten with a sudden, inexplicable fear. I tried to laugh it off. "Did you invite someone you forgot to tell me about?" "No," my mother said too quickly. "I mean, maybe it's just a neighbor." But her voice was thin, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. From where I stood, I could see the hallway leading to the front door. My father opened it just a crack, his broad shoulders blocking most of the view. I couldn't hear what was being said, only the low murmur of voices. Then the door opened wider. A woman stepped inside. She looked to be in her late 50s, maybe early 60s, with streaks of gray running through her dark hair. Her clothes were simple, almost out of place compared to the semi-formal outfits in the room. She held a small purse clutched tightly in both hands, like a shield. Her eyes moved quickly around the crowded living room, searching, anxious, and when they landed on me, she stopped breathing. I had never seen her before in my life. I was sure of it. But the way she stared at me made my skin prickle, as if she knew me intimately. My father stepped in front of her, speaking in a hushed, urgent tone. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice shaking just enough for me to notice. The woman didn't look at him. Her gaze stayed locked on me. Slowly, she took a step forward. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice rough, like she had been crying for hours before arriving. "I know this isn't the right time, but I couldn't wait anymore." Conversations in the room began to die out one by one, as people noticed the tension at the door. My mother's face had gone pale. She gripped the back of a chair, so tightly that her knuckles turned white. I felt rooted to the spot, caught between curiosity and a growing sense of dread. There was something about the woman's eyes, dark, familiar in a way I couldn't explain, that made my stomach twist. She took another step closer, her hands trembling. When she finally spoke again, she didn't address my parents. She spoke directly to me. "Happy birthday," she whispered. "I've been waiting 30 years to say that to you." A nervous laugh escaped me before I could stop it. "Do I know you?" Tears filled her eyes, spilling down her cheeks as she shook her head slowly. "No," she said, her voice breaking. "But you should." The room fell into a silence so complete that I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock in the hallway. Conversations that had filled the space only seconds earlier were gone, replaced by a heavy stillness that pressed against my chest. Every pair of eyes shifted between me, the stranger, and my parents, as if everyone sensed something important was about to happen, but no one understood what. My father stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of the woman. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck stood out. "You need to leave," he said, his voice low but firm. "This is a private family event." The woman barely seemed to hear him. Her gaze stayed locked on me, studying my face with an intensity that made my skin prickle. There was something raw in her expression, grief, hope, fear, all tangled together in a way that made my stomach twist. "I'm not here to cause a scene," she said, her voice shaking despite her effort to stay composed. I needed to see her. Just once. On her birthday." My mother let out a sharp, breathless sound. "Stop it," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "You promised you'd never come back." The words cut through the room like glass. I turned to look at my mother, confusion rising fast enough to make me dizzy. "Come back?" I echoed. "What is she talking about?" No one answered me. The stranger took another cautious step forward. My father reached out as if to stop her, but she slipped past him before he could react. She was close enough now that I could see the fine lines around her eyes, and the way her hands trembled as she clutched her purse. Up close. There was something unsettlingly familiar about her face. The shape of her cheekbones, the curve of her mouth. It felt like looking into a distorted mirror of someone I should recognize but couldn't quite place. "My name is Sarah," she said softly. "I know this is overwhelming, but you deserve to hear the truth." My heart began to pound. I glanced at my parents, expecting them to interrupt, to laugh and explain that this was some kind of misunderstanding. Instead, my father stared at the floor, and my mother looked like she might collapse. "What truth?" I asked, my voice coming out thinner than I intended. Sarah swallowed hard. "The truth about who you are," she said. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Someone dropped a fork onto a plate with a sharp clatter. I felt heat rise to my face, a mix of embarrassment and anger. This was my birthday party, my home, and this stranger was speaking in riddles in front of everyone I cared about. "Okay, that's enough," I said, forcing a shaky laugh. "If this is some kind of joke, it's not funny. Mom, Dad, can someone please explain what's going on?" My mother's eyes filled with tears. She shook her head over and over, like she was trying to deny something she couldn't escape. "You shouldn't be here," she said to Sarah, her voice cracking. "You have no right." Sarah flinched, but she didn't look away from me. Slowly, she opened her purse and pulled out a worn envelope. The paper was creased and yellowed at the edges, like it had been folded and unfolded countless times over the years. "I didn't want to do this in front of everyone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But they left me no other choice." My father finally moved, stepping between us again. "Don't you dare," he warned, his voice rough with panic. "Put that away." But Sarah's hands were already moving. She slid a photograph out of the envelope and held it out toward me. "I just want her to see," she said. For a moment, I hesitated. Every instinct in my body told me to step back, to refuse whatever she was trying to show me. But curiosity, and a strange, growing dread, pulled me forward. I reached out and took the photograph from her trembling fingers. It showed a young woman lying in a hospital bed, her dark hair damp with sweat, a newborn baby cradled against her chest. The woman looked exhausted but radiant, her eyes shining with tears and joy. A date was scrawled in blue ink at the bottom of the photo. The date was the same as my birthday. I stared at the baby in the picture, at the tiny wrinkled face and the shock of dark hair. Then I looked back at the woman holding me. Even younger, even without the lines and gray streaks, I knew that face now. It was Sarah's. My breath caught in my throat. Why are you showing me this?" I asked, though a cold, creeping suspicion was already forming in my mind. "Because that's you," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "And I'm the one who gave birth to you." The words seemed to echo in the room, bouncing off the walls and sinking into my skin. For a second, I couldn't process them. They hung in the air, impossible and absurd. "That's not funny," I said automatically, shaking my head. "That's not possible." My parents, I gestured toward my mother and father, searching their faces for confirmation, for denial, for anything that would make sense of what was happening. My mother had started to cry silently, her shoulders shaking. My father looked like he had aged 10 years in the span of a minute. "She's lying," he said, but the conviction in his voice was gone. It sounded hollow, like a line he was repeating because he didn't know what else to say. Sarah reached back into her purse and pulled out a stack of documents, their edges neatly clipped together. "I have hospital records," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "Birth certificates, police reports. I've spent 30 years fighting to prove what they did." My hands began to shake. "Stop," I whispered, but she kept talking. "They told me you died," she continued, tears streaming freely down her face now. "They said there were complications and that I never even got to hold you." I was young and alone and terrified, and I believed them. But something in my heart always told me it wasn't true. A murmur of shock spread through the guests. I felt like I was floating outside my own body, watching the scene unfold from a distance. This couldn't be real. It sounded like the plot of some melodramatic movie, not my life. "I searched for years," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "I went back to the hospital, asked questions, filed complaints. Eventually, someone admitted there had been irregularities, paperwork that didn't match, nurses who suddenly quit. And then, One day, I saw a picture of you online, a school award ceremony, your parents standing beside you, smiling. My stomach churned. I thought about all the family photos my mother had proudly posted over the years, all the milestones she had shared. Had Sarah been watching from the sidelines all this time? That's insane, I said weakly. Why would they do that? Why would my parents? I stopped mid-sentence, because I couldn't bring myself to finish it. Sarah's eyes softened as she looked at me. Because they couldn't have children, she said gently. And I was young, unmarried, and alone. They saw an opportunity, and they took it. A strangled sound escaped my mother. We loved you, she sobbed. We gave you everything. I turned to her, my vision blurring with tears. Is it true? I asked, my voice barely audible. Did you take me from her? The silence that followed was louder than any scream. My father's shoulders sagged. He didn't look at me as he spoke. We were desperate, he said hoarsely. Wood tried for years. Your mother had suffered miscarriage after miscarriage. When we heard about a young girl at the hospital with no family support, we thought we were saving you. Giving you a better life. The room seemed to tilt. I grabbed the edge of the table to steady myself, my mind racing as every memory of my childhood suddenly felt fragile and uncertain. You told me you adopted me, I said, my voice shaking. You said it was legal. You said my birth mother didn't want me? My mother sobbed harder, covering her face with her hands. My father closed his eyes. We had to tell you something, he whispered. A sound escaped my throat, half laugh, half sob. Around us, our guests stood frozen, unsure whether to stay or leave, witnesses to a moment that was tearing my life apart. I looked down at the photograph still clutched in my hand, the image of a young woman holding a newborn baby with fierce, desperate love. Then I looked back at Sarah, who watched me with a mixture of hope and heartbreak. The stranger at my birthday party wasn't a stranger at all. And in the span of a few unbearable minutes, everything I thought I knew about my life had begun to unravel. I don't remember deciding to leave. One moment I was standing in the middle of the living room, with the photograph crumpling in my shaking hands. And the next I was pushing past people, ignoring the way they called my name as I stumbled toward the front door. The air inside the house had become too thick to breathe, filled with whispers, pity, and the echo of my father's confession. The cold night air hit my face like a slap when I stepped outside. I stood on the front porch, my chest heaving as I tried to draw in a full breath. My hands were trembling so badly that I dropped my car keys on the wooden steps. They clattered loudly in the quiet neighborhood, the sound sharp and unreal. Behind me, the front door creaked open. Please don't go. My mother's voice pleaded. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. If I saw her face, I might break, and I wasn't sure what I would do if that happened. I need air, I said, my voice hoarse. I can't be in there right now. Footsteps approached cautiously. You shouldn't be alone, she said, reaching out as if to touch my arm. I flinched away from her without thinking. The movement shocked both of us. I had never pulled away from my mother before. Not once in my entire life. Don't, I whispered, wrapping my arms around myself. Just don't. Silence stretched between us, heavy and fragile. I could feel her standing just behind me, close enough that I could hear her uneven breathing. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she said finally, her voice breaking. We were going to tell you. We always planned to tell you when you were older, when you could understand. A bitter laugh escaped me. I'm 30, I said, turning to face her at last. When exactly was I going to be old enough? 40? 50? Her eyes were swollen and red, her carefully styled hair coming loose around her face. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, like the confident woman who had raised me had been replaced by someone fragile and frightened. We loved you, she said again, as if repeating it would somehow fix everything. From the moment we saw you, we loved you. I stared at her, my heart twisting painfully. Part of me wanted to believe her, to cling to the version of my life where my parents were just imperfect but loving. But another part of me, the part that had just learned my entire identity was built on a lie, felt a growing, burning anger. Love isn't supposed to involve lying to someone for 30 years, I said quietly. The front door opened wider, and my father stepped outside, followed by Sarah. The porch light cast harsh shadows across their faces, making the moment feel even more surreal. Guests lingered in the doorway behind them, pretending not to watch while obviously listening to every word. "This isn't a conversation for outside," my father said, his voice strained. "Let's go back in and talk like a family." Sarah let out a shaky breath. "She has the right to know everything," she said, clutching her purse to her chest. "You don't get to control this anymore." My father's jaw tightened. "You've done enough damage for one night." I held up a hand before they could start arguing. "Stop," I said, my voice louder than I expected. "All of you, just stop." They fell silent, their eyes turning to me. For the first time in my life, I felt like the only adult in a room full of people who had lost control. "I need answers," I said, forcing the words past the lump in my throat. "Not half-truths. Not excuses. I want to know exactly what happened." No one spoke for a few seconds. Finally, Sarah stepped forward. "I'll tell you," she said gently. We ended up sitting in the quiet of my parents' backyard, away from the curious ears inside the house. The party decorations looked out of place in the dim light. Balloons swaying softly in the breeze, as if they belonged to a different night, a different life. Sarah sat across from me at the patio table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea my mother had silently brought out. My parents sat side by side, tense and pale, their shoulders almost touching but not quite. The distance between them felt symbolic of the cracks that had suddenly appeared in everything I knew. "I was 19 when I had you," Sarah began, her voice soft but steady. "I was in my second year of college. Your father, your biological father, left when he found out I was pregnant. My parents were strict and ashamed. They told me I had ruined my life." I listened, my chest aching at the pain in her voice. She spoke of doctor's appointments she attended alone, of whispers in hospital hallways, of the fear that followed her through every month of her pregnancy. "The day you were born, I held you for maybe 10 minutes, she said, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You were so small. You had this tiny birthmark near your collarbone, shaped like a crescent moon. I remember tracing it with my finger and thinking you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen." My hand instinctively went to my collarbone, to the small crescent-shaped mark I had always been told was just a random birthmark. "Then a nurse came in and said there were complications," Sarah continued. "They took you away. A doctor came back later and told me you didn't make it. He said you'd stopped breathing." A cold wave of horror washed over me as she spoke. I turned slowly to my parents. My mother had covered her mouth with her hand, tears streaming down her face. My father stared at the ground, unable to meet my eyes. "That's not true," he said weakly. "We were told you had signed papers, that you didn't want to keep the baby." Sarah shook her head violently. "I never signed anything," she said. "I begged them to bring her back to me. I screamed until my throat hurt. But they told me to be quiet and rest. They said it was for the best." The pieces of the story felt jagged and impossible to hold together. "So how did they get me?" I asked, my voice trembling. My father rubbed his face with both hands. "A nurse we knew, she approached us," he admitted. "She said there was a young mother who didn't want her baby, and that the paperwork could be arranged. We were desperate. We didn't ask enough questions, we just agreed." "You paid them?" Sarah said, her voice laced with bitterness. My father hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes." The word echoed in my head. "Paid." As if I had been an object, a transaction, something to be bought and taken home. I pushed my chair back slightly, the legs scraping against the stone patio. My hands were shaking again, my thoughts spinning so fast I could barely keep up with them. "All those years," I whispered, staring at the ground. "All those birthdays, all those family vacations, you just pretended like everything was normal." "It was normal to us." My mother sobbed. "You were our daughter. You are our daughter." I looked up at her, tears blurring my vision. "I don't even know what that means anymore." Sarah reached across the table hesitantly, stopping just short of touching my hand. "I'm not here to take you away from them," she said softly. "I just wanted you to know that I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day." Her words settled over me, both comforting and devastating at the same time. Two women, both claiming to love me, both part of a story built on lies and loss. The night stretched on around us, quiet except for the distant sound of cars passing on the street. Inside the house, the party had dissolved into awkward murmurs and hushed conversations. My 30th birthday had turned into a courtroom without a judge, a trial without rules, and I was the only one whose life was being dissected. As I sat there, listening to the people who had shaped my existence argue over what was right and wrong, I felt something inside me shift. The shock was still there, the grief and confusion pressing down on me, but beneath it all, a small, steady determination began to grow. If my entire life had been built on secrets, then I was the only one who could uncover the truth. And for the first time since the stranger had walked through the front door, I realized that the story of my life no longer belonged to my parents. It belonged to me. The morning after my birthday felt like waking up in someone else's life. My phone was filled with missed calls and messages, friends asking if I was okay, relatives offering awkward reassurances, and one long, emotional text from my mother that I couldn't bring myself to read. I stayed in bed longer than I had in years, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word from the night before. The photograph of Sarah holding me as a newborn lay on my nightstand, where I had placed it before falling into a restless sleep. In the pale daylight, it looked even more real, even more impossible to ignore. I called in sick to work. There was no way I could sit through meetings and pretend to care about deadlines while my entire identity hung in the balance. Instead, I spent the morning pacing my apartment, picking things up and putting them down, trying to figure out where to begin. The idea that there were documents somewhere, records that could confirm or deny what I had been told, gnawed at me. If the truth existed on paper, then I needed to see it for myself. By noon, I was standing outside the hospital where I had supposedly been born. The building looked smaller than I remembered from childhood visits to sick relatives. Its white paint slightly faded, the sign out front chipped at the edges. People walked in and out through the sliding doors, living ordinary lives, completely unaware that for me, this place held the key to everything. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. I approached the reception desk, my hands damp with sweat, and explained that I was looking for my birth records. The receptionist gave me a polite but guarded smile and asked for my identification. When I handed over my driver's license, she typed something into her computer, her expression shifting from neutral to confused. "There seems to be limited information under your name," she said carefully. "Do you have the name of your birth mother?" The word birth mother felt strange on her lips, like it belonged to someone else's story. "Sarah Malik," I said, my voice steady despite the knot in my throat. She typed again, then frowned. "I'm sorry, but I'll need to get a supervisor. Some of these records are archived." I sat in a row of plastic chairs for nearly 30 minutes, my knee bouncing with nervous energy, before a middle-aged man in a neatly pressed shirt approached me. He introduced himself as Mr. Farouk from hospital administration and led me to a small office down the hall. He closed the door gently behind us and sat across from me, folding his hands on the desk. "I understand you have some questions about records from 30 years ago," he said. His tone was calm, but there was a tightness around his eyes that made me uneasy. I explained everything as simply as I could. What Sarah had told me, what my parents had admitted, and why I needed to know the truth. As I spoke, I watched his expression carefully. At first he looked skeptical, then gradually more serious, as if he was remembering something he had hoped to forget. After a moment of silence, he turned to his computer and began searching through old digital archives. "There was an internal investigation many years ago," he said slowly. "It involved a small number of staff and some irregularities in maternity records from that time period." My heart began to race. "Irregularities," I repeated. He nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Files that didn't match. Discrepancies between reported stillbirths and actual outcomes. At the time, it was treated as a clerical issue. A few nurses resigned, and the matter was quietly closed." Quietly closed. The words echoed in my mind, heavy with implication. After several minutes, he printed out a set of documents and slid them across the desk toward me. "These are copies," he said. "The originals are in storage. I'm not authorized to make any legal statements, but you have the right to see what's in your file." My hands trembled as I picked up the papers. The first page was a birth record listing my date and time of birth, my weight, and the name of my mother, Sarah Malik. My eyes scanned the lines again and again, as if expecting them to change. The next page was a discharge summary, except instead of listing me as sent home with my mother, it marked me as deceased within hours of birth. I felt the air leave my lungs. "This says I died," I whispered. Mr. Farouk nodded grimly. "Yes. But there is no corresponding death certificate in the municipal records." That was one of the discrepancies noted during the investigation. The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the edge of the desk to steady myself, my mind struggling to process the enormity of what I was seeing. Official hospital records claimed I had died, yet here I was, sitting in front of him, alive. "There's more," he said gently, sliding another sheet toward me. It was a handwritten note from a nurse, documenting that the infant had been transferred to a private room for further observation. The signature at the bottom matched a name my father had mentioned the night before, the nurse who had approached them. "She left the hospital 2 days later," Mr. Farouk said quietly. "No forwarding address." A mix of anger and nausea churned in my stomach. The story Sarah had told wasn't just an emotional memory, it was backed by evidence. Someone had falsified records, declared me dead on paper, and handed me over to a couple who were willing to pay for a child. I left the hospital with the copies clutched tightly in my bag, my thoughts spinning. Outside, the afternoon sun felt too bright, the sounds of traffic too loud. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine, staring at the steering wheel and trying to decide where to go next. In the end, I drove to Sarah's apartment. She opened the door before I even knocked, as if she had been standing on the other side waiting. Her eyes widened when she saw me, a mixture of hope and fear flashing across her face. "I went to the hospital," I said without preamble, stepping inside. "They gave me copies of the records." Her hands flew to her mouth. "And?" I pulled the papers out and handed them to her. She read them slowly, her eyes moving over the lines as tears began to fall. When she reached the part where my status was listed as deceased, she let out a broken sob and sank into the nearest chair. "They really did it," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "They really made it look like you were gone." I sat across from her, watching as 30 years of doubt and grief seemed to collapse into a single moment of validation. For so long, she had been treated like a hysterical young woman who couldn't accept a tragedy. Now there was proof that she had been right all along. "I don't know what to do with this," I admitted quietly. "I feel like my entire life has been a crime scene, and I'm only just now starting to see the evidence." Sarah wiped her eyes and looked at me, her expression soft but determined. "You don't have to decide everything at once," she said. "But you deserve to know the whole truth. And you deserve justice." The word justice sounded heavy, complicated. It meant lawyers, police reports, and public scrutiny. It meant dragging my parents, the people who had raised me, through a legal system that would label them criminals. The thought made my stomach twist with guilt and anger in equal measure. That evening, I sat alone in my apartment again, the documents spread out across my coffee table. I studied every line, every signature, every date, trying to piece together the timeline of my own stolen beginning. The more I read, the clearer it became my life hadn't started with a loving adoption story. It had started with lies, forged paperwork, and a transaction carried out in a hospital room. I thought about my childhood, birthday parties, bedtime stories, school recitals where my parents had cheered the loudest. None of those memories were fake, yet they were built on a foundation of deception. The love I had felt had been real, but so had the crime that made it possible. For the first time since the truth had come out, anger began to outweigh the shock. Not just anger at my parents, but at a system that had allowed this to happen, at the nurses who had walked away without consequences, at the years Sarah had spent grieving a child who had been alive all along. I picked up the birth record again, tracing my finger over the name written in neat, official ink Sarah Malik. It was the first time I had ever seen my real mother's name attached to mine in a document that wasn't hidden or denied. Who I was hadn't changed overnight, but the story of how I came into the world had. And with that knowledge came a responsibility I hadn't asked for, the choice of whether to leave the past buried or to dig it up and force the truth into the light. As the sun set outside my window, casting long shadows across the room, I realized that staying silent would mean accepting the lie as part of me forever. And after everything I had learned, I wasn't sure I could live with that. The decision didn't come in a dramatic flash of courage or a single moment of clarity. It crept in slowly over the following days, settling into my chest like a quiet certainty I couldn't ignore. Every time I looked at the documents from the hospital or at the photograph of Sarah holding me as a newborn, I felt the same tightening in my stomach. The truth was no longer something I could pretend I didn't know. It was written in ink, in signatures, in the haunted look in Sarah's eyes and the guilty silence of the people who had raised me. My parents called constantly. At first, I ignored every call and let their messages pile up in my voicemail. When I finally listened to them, my mother's voice was shaky and desperate. She kept repeating that they loved me, that they never meant to hurt anyone, that they were afraid of losing me now, that everything had come out. My father's messages were shorter, more controlled, but I could hear the strain beneath his steady tone. He asked to meet, to talk things through like adults, to find a way forward as a family. For days, I couldn't bring myself to respond. I moved through my routine like a ghost, showing up to work, answering emails, smiling politely when coworkers asked about my birthday party. Inside, I felt hollowed out, like someone had taken a chisel to the foundation of my life and left cracks running through everything. It was Sarah who finally pushed me to stop hiding. We were sitting in her small living room one evening, drinking tea that had long since gone cold. She had been careful not to pressure me, always telling me that I could take as much time as I needed. But that night, she looked at me with a quiet seriousness I hadn't seen before. "You can't stay in limbo forever," she said gently. "No matter what you decide, you need to tell them. For your own peace." Her words stayed with me long after I left her apartment. She was right. Avoiding my parents wasn't protecting me anymore, it was just delaying the inevitable. The truth had already destroyed the version of my family I used to believe in. The only thing left was to decide what kind of future I wanted to build from the ruins. I called my parents the next morning and asked them to meet me at a quiet cafe halfway between my apartment and their house. My voice sounded calm on the phone, but my hands were shaking so badly that I had to set the receiver down after hanging up and press my palms against the table to steady them. They were already seated when I arrived, sitting side by side at a small corner table. My mother looked thinner than she had a week earlier, her eyes rimmed with dark circles. My father stood when he saw me, pulling out a chair as if we were still playing our old roles, still pretending everything was normal. For a few seconds, none of us spoke. The clink of dishes and the low hum of other conversations filled the silence between us. I took a seat and folded my hands in my lap, forcing myself to meet their eyes. "I went to the hospital," I said finally. My mother's lips parted in a small gasp. My father's shoulders tensed. I placed a folder on the table and slid it toward them. Inside were copies of the records, the same ones that had kept me awake at night since I'd received them. They read in silence. My mother's hands began to tremble halfway through, and by the time she reached the page listing me as deceased, tears were dripping onto the paper. My father stared at the documents with a hollow expression, his face pale. "It's all there," I said quietly. "Everything Sarah told me. The falsified records, the missing death certificate, the nurse who disappeared." My mother let out a broken sob. "We didn't know it was like this," she insisted. "We thought it was an arrangement. We thought her family had given you up." "You still paid for me," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "You took a baby from a hospital and never once questioned why it had to be done in secret." My father rubbed his temples, his shoulders slumping. "We were wrong," he admitted. "I see that now. But you were our daughter. You were already in our arms. What were we supposed to do, give you back and pretend you didn't exist? The question hung in the air, painful and complicated. I understood, in some distant way, the desperation that must have driven them. But understanding didn't erase what they had done. I'm not here to argue about what you should have done 30 years ago, I said. I'm here to tell you what I'm going to do now. They both looked up at me, fear flashing across their faces. I've decided to reclaim my birth name, I continued. The words felt strange but powerful on my tongue. I'm going to have it legally restored. And I'm going to build a relationship with Sarah. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Are you cutting us out of your life? The question pierced me more deeply than I expected. Despite everything, a part of me still cared about their pain. But I knew I couldn't let guilt make my choices for me anymore. I'm not pretending the last 30 years didn't happen, I said softly. You raised me. You were there for every scraped knee and every school play, but you also lied to me every single day of my life. I need distance to figure out who I am without that lie hanging over me. My father nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. "You deserve that," he said quietly. My mother reached across the table as if to grab my hand, then hesitated, remembering how I had pulled away before. She let her hand fall back into her lap, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Will you ever forgive us?" she whispered. I didn't answer right away. The truth was, I didn't know. Forgiveness felt like a distant concept, something I might or might not reach someday. All I knew was that I couldn't offer it just to make them feel better. I need time, I said finally. Maybe years. Maybe more. We sat there for a while longer, talking in halting, careful sentences about practical things, legal processes, old photographs, what to tell extended family. It felt less like a family conversation and more like a quiet negotiation between strangers who shared too much history to ever fully walk away. In the weeks that followed, I began the process of legally changing my name. Filling out the forms felt surreal, like I was rewriting the opening line of my own story. Each signature was a small act of defiance against the lie that had defined me for so long. I also started spending more time with Sarah. Our relationship was awkward at first, filled with long pauses and cautious questions. We were strangers bound by blood, trying to learn each other's habits, favorite foods, and ways of speaking. She showed me old letters she had written to me over the years, but never had the chance to send. I told her about my childhood, my career, the little quirks I had inherited from a life she had only watched from afar. One afternoon, she handed me a small box filled with baby clothes she had kept all these years. The fabric was yellowed with age, but neatly folded, as if she had always believed she would get the chance to give them to me. I held one tiny sweater in my hands and felt tears spill down my cheeks, not just for the years we had lost, but for the quiet, stubborn hope she had carried through all of them. The legal process took months, but the day my new identification arrived in the mail, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the name printed on the card. It felt unfamiliar, like trying on a new pair of shoes that didn't quite fit yet. But it was mine in a way my old name had never been, a piece of my identity that hadn't been chosen in secret by someone else. My parents and I spoke occasionally, our conversations polite but distant. They sent messages on holidays, sometimes attaching old photos of me as a child. I didn't know what our relationship would look like in the future, only that it would never return to what it had been before. On the first birthday I celebrated after learning the truth, Sarah baked a small cake and placed it in front of me with a shy smile. There were no balloons, no crowded living room, no elaborate decorations, just the two of us sitting at her kitchen table. "Make a wish," she said softly. I looked at the single candle flickering in the dim light and thought about the girl I had been a year earlier, blowing out 30 candles, believing her life was simple and secure. I thought about the pain of discovering the truth, the anger, the confusion, and the long, exhausting process of rebuilding myself from the ground up. This time, my wish was different. It wasn't for happiness or success or even closure. It was for strength, the strength to live honestly, to face the complicated love I felt for two families, and to keep moving forward even when the past tried to pull me back. I blew out the candle, and the thin trail of smoke curled into the air between us. My life hadn't turned out the way anyone had planned. It had begun with lies, been shaped by secrets, and nearly shattered by the truth. But as I sat there in the quiet kitchen, holding a slice of cake baked by the woman who had given birth to me, I realized something that felt both painful and freeing. The story of who I was no longer belonged to the people who had stolen it. It belonged to me.